Good afternoon. I'm Jim Keating. I'm the director of the Humanities program here at BC, which is sponsoring our first annual Veritas Conference. So, welcome to it. The Humanities program at Providence College exists to promote rigorous interdisciplinary study here at Providence College in light of the Catholic and Dominican intellectual tradition. We combine extensive extracurricular opportunities for our students and the entire college community. This is one of them. We offer an intellectual and spiritual formation that imparts the skills needed to make a living and life-changing opportunity to develop wisdom needed for living well. You can see, if this is a plug that I didn't put in here, but you can go to our website, humanities.providence.edu, to see more about it. The theme of this inaugural Veritas Conference is an ongoing cultural crisis represented by the challenges of alienation and identity. A significant swath of the American populace, on the left as well as the right, has concluded that the American dream is dead. It is clear that many of the voters who feel this way come from places where stable marriages and family networks are in steep decline, where meaningful work and thriving trade associations have collapsed, and most significantly, where church doors have been shuttered. In short, recent alienation can be attributed to the decline of civil society. We can no longer flourish as individuals because our communal bonds are dissolving. We also experience a revolution in the way that the human self is conceived. Personal identity is now focused primarily on one's inner psychological life, independent of biological constitution or socially assigned roles. We owe it to ourselves, it is commonly believed, to live authentically, that is, to enact our external, publicly recognized lives in harmony with who we, in the inner recesses of our own psychology, believe or feel ourselves to be. This situation represents a cultural crisis. We cannot flourish unless we have communal structures that sustain us, yet our culture increasingly presses us towards a highly individualized understanding of ourselves and our own good. Therefore, we ask, what resources for responding to this cultural crisis are offered by the Christian tradition? This afternoon, we will hear from our first keynote speaker, Tim Carney, who will deliver the inaugural John F. Fay 1968 plenary address of the 2022 Veritas Conference. The Humanities program is grateful for a generous gift from the estate of the late John F. Fay. This lecture is dedicated to the memory of his generosity. Our speaker this afternoon is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, columnist for the Washington Examiner, and the author of 3 books, most recently, Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. That, by the way, is the book which sparked the idea for this conference. Tim has written articles in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Atlantic, National Review, and other publications. He and his wife raised 6 children in the Washington, D.C. area. So we're up to 16, because last night Peter Leithart has 10. So I don't know, we'll have to find out what Carl Truman can contribute when he comes. It is my pleasure to welcome Tim to PC and all of you to our inaugural conference. Please know that you are invited to join us in a reception in the hall following Tim's address. And we invite our registered guests to stay for dinner, and whoever wants to if they ask nicely, in the Ruane Great Room afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Carney to the podium.
Thank you. What?
Oh, wait, I got to shut up with the mic.
Here, you can take it. There we Thank you guys for having me. I'm not used to being outclassed by previous speakers on numbers of children, so I'll have to come up with some other way to shine here. It's incredibly flattering if the theme of the conference is inspired by Alienated America, but I'm going somewhere new in what I want to talk about today, in part to tie it to the broader theme, not just alienation, but also identity. I'm a journalist, and so I make my points, arguments, insights through stories. And so it is a story about the American dream and the belief that it's dead. Today it's going to be a bit of a winding story. I hope it won't take too long, but it is going to take us through idyllic small towns and pretty bad scenes of violence in America. There's going to be alienation, there's going to be modernity, there's going to be all sorts of stuff, but it's ultimately a story about family, community, belonging, and it's a story about faith. And because I'm a political reporter, the story, naturally enough, begins in Iowa. And because I'm an Irish Catholic, the story, naturally enough, begins in a bar. Joe's Place in Iowa City, a few weeks before the 2016 caucuses, I met a couple who worked at the university out there. The lady told me she had grown up in Orange City in northwest Iowa. And I'd been covering the caucuses since the 2004 cycle. I'd never been to Orange City. And also, as I said, I'm an Irish Catholic. I'm from New York. Those of you who know your history know that the color orange can be a little triggering to Irish Catholics. So I asked this woman, I said, was this some northwest Iowa town full of Ulstermen marching through the streets? She said, no, orange is orange, it's Dutch. It's a very Dutch town. And I love this sort of talk. And I'm from the Northeast, I moved down to DC, and I see a lot of, there's not as much sort of ethnicity, right? I'm like, come on, really, middle America? We have Irish, we have Polish in New York, we have Italian neighborhoods. You have a Dutch place? How Dutch is it really? And so this woman, her name was Holly Vander something, she said, let me put it this way. I used to wear wooden clogs marching past Windmill Square for the annual Tulip Festival. Not back in the Netherlands, but there in Iowa. This sounded like a Simpsons episode, like a send-up of Dutch people. And then I looked at pictures, and they really do wear, I don't know the proper terminology, it's not lederhosen, but it really is this incredibly Dutch place that looks like Holland in the middle of Iowa. So I had to go there. 2016 caucuses, I was there for a Jeb Bush rally. And very, very Dutch, but one of the other things I noticed was that it wasn't like a lot of rural America. And I looked at the data, and I found that of all Iowa counties, Orange City, Sioux County had the lowest rate of high school dropouts. It had the lowest rate of drug overdoses. It had the highest rate of married adults. It had a higher birth rate and a lower out-of-wedlock birth rate. The plagues of middle America, rural America, working class America weren't hitting Orange City. They weren't hitting Sioux County. They weren't hitting this county of Dutch people. So there was also a political salience. And I'm going to mostly avoid politics today, but we can talk about it later. But it turned out to be Donald Trump's single worst county in the Iowa caucuses, and then his single best county in the general election. That is, it was a very conservative, pro-life place that wasn't interested in the message of the guy whose first speech had the phrase, "The American dream is dead." So I began to wonder, is there something about the Dutch that they have the American dream? So I went out before the Michigan primaries to Holland, Michigan, and the electoral results were the same. Trump won the state, except Ted Cruz won in the primaries. Ted Cruz won the Dutch parts of the state. And again, when in my reporting, in the data I saw, there was just a lot more community cohesion. Later, there would be an article about Orange City in the New Yorker. And the way they put it, channeling the arguments of the people who live there, saying, look, there are plenty of jobs. It'll take you to work. When you have children, we'll help you take care of them. People here share your values. It's a good Christian place, and they care about you. If anything happens, they'll have your back. So when I'd been in Orange City, I asked this one guy, he was the husband of a professor, and he made it clear that he was sort of politically on the left. And he said, I love it here, though. He says, they vote right, but they live left. And for a second, I thought, I have a story here. Is this a bunch of farmers who at night are like pot-smoking swingers? But I said, what do you mean live left? He said, let me get the exact quote. That's just what you do. You care about your neighbors. You care about your environment, but you also take care of it yourself. You don't rely on the government. Now, I was peeved. I'm a conservative guy. I was like, how is that living left? But I understood what he meant, right? He meant that there was that people loved their neighbors, took care of those who needed help, and looked after those in need. Now, I don't want to litigate his idea that that was left, but it might be an interesting thing down the line to think about that. Wisconsin primary came up, so I visited Oostburg, the village that's about 50% Dutch. I got there on a Sunday morning trying to think, okay, as political reporters, we know there's like a Hispanic vote. We know there's a Jewish vote. There isn't a Catholic vote, which is another interesting thing. But who knew there was a Dutch vote? What is going on here? I actually asked Ted Cruz about this in Wisconsin. I said, why do you keep winning these Dutch places? And he said, well, Tim, you've met the Dutch people. You know they're really nice. The Donald, he's not nice. They want to vote for someone who's nice. And I'm thinking, like Ted Cruz? Not sure that theory there. Somebody else said, the Dutch were upset at Trump for appropriating the color orange. I knew that was also not true. So I sit down at Judy's place in Oostburg, and because it's a Sunday morning, I finally saw what should have been obvious, what was going on here. The families came pouring in from the 9 a.m. services at the First Presbyterian Church, the 9:30 services at the First Christian Reformed Church, and, before that, the 9 a.m. services at the First Reformed Church, which is not the same as a First Christian Reformed Church. Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian had a 9:15, and half of those people would go back on Sunday night for the Bible study or the second service. This was in a village of 2,000 people, 4 Christian Reformed churches in a village of 2,000 people. So the thing that made these Dutch communities so strong, that people would come back after they graduated college, that they had better outcomes, drugs, schooling, marriage, etc. What made them so strong were the churches and the Christian schools and the other institutions that spun out of them. The Reformed churches had planted themselves in clusters around Middle America and formed hardy, robust, tightly knit communities that avoided the afflictions of so much of rural America, the inequality, the retreat from marriage, out-of-wedlock births, opioids, and deaths of despair. Now, it's not just the Dutch, though the saying I learned at Judy's Diner was, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. But I found others who were much. The Mormons, I went straight to confession saying I was envying the Mormons. I wish that my Catholic parishes were as tightly knit as the Mormon wards there. The welfare system they have, which we can talk about later, is absolutely amazing. And so Mormon counties in Utah and Idaho. And I saw it closer to home. Where I live is Silver Spring, Maryland, and one of the neighborhoods in Silver Spring is called Kemp Mill. I was just at the Purim celebrations at 2 of the Orthodox synagogues in Kemp Mill. I did Purim because it's not a Sabbath, so it wasn't bugging them if I had my tape recorder out. And they observe the Sabbath at these 2 synagogues pretty strongly, which means nobody drives on the Sabbath, which means you have to live within walking distance of your synagogue. You can imagine what this results in with a little bit of imagination. You're in a neighborhood where you're surrounded by hundreds of other families who are pro-family, who have the same values as you, who are engaged in the same undertaking as you, which is raising children and trying yourself to love God more. And again, great outcomes there. And politically, and I'm going to move on from this, but in the Republican primaries, Trump won Silver Spring, which is sort of the middle-class part of Montgomery County, Maryland. Ted Cruz dominated the 2 precincts that were in Kemp Mill, which allowed me in Alienated America to have a sub-headline that said, Jews for Cruz. But the same sort of things happened politically and outcome-wise in places that were very much unlike Oostburg or unlike Orange City, Iowa. The other Montgomery County place is Chevy Chase. You guys might have heard of this. This is where Brett Kavanaugh grew up. It's actually the wealthiest municipality in the D.C. area. Chevy Chase, again, I joked earlier about living left was pot-smoking swingers. In Chevy Chase, they mostly vote left and live right, I could say, if I wanted to use that same language. Everybody there finishes school, gets married, finishes school, gets a job, gets married, has kids, stays involved in their kids' lives, and probably coaches t-ball just like I do. And actually, their pews at Blessed Sacrament are more full than in rural Maryland, but also even if they are much more secular than Oostburg or Salt Lake City or a more Mormon part of Utah, they have other things that they belong to. And so these things that seem like two different phenomena, the good outcomes in the elite circles of America and the good outcomes in Oostburg and Salt Lake City and Kent Mill, are one phenomenon. It is a phenomenon of people who live somewhere that's planted thick with strong institutions of civil society, institutions that give us a sense of meaning, that give us support, a human-level safety net, that give us mentoring, that allow us to belong. And that belonging is the key, because it allows us to, in a much better way, form identity. I began Alienated America with a tale of when my daughter was in the hospital. I'll tell you all, you should buy the book and read the story. I'll give you the very quick version. She was in the hospital with a breathing issue. This was before COVID. And after we found it would be all right, we knew we were going to be there for 6 days, which is not that long, but for us it was massively long, and she was only 1 year old. And at one point the nurse asked me, she's like, people keep smuggling in like dark chocolate or like beer, which was not technically allowed by the hospital, or barbecue, which was, and I loved. Like, who are all these people bringing you food? And I started describing who they were. I was like, oh, well, that was a couple from our pool. That was a family from our boys' school. That was somebody from my wife's book club. That was somebody from AEI. And just without even thinking about it, I realized that the network of friends that was supporting us, that was picking up the carpool, that was stocking our fridge with all these great, my kids never ate better at lunch than they did the week that I was not making them lunch. They weren't just friends. I had thought about it like, oh, I got a bunch of friends. You could list them when you put on Evite, right? No, but it was all a hub and spokes system. I was connected to each of them by an institution: the pool, the church, the school, the book club, the community, etc. There's tons of research on belonging to things giving you good outcomes. Socially isolated were more likely to die in a given year than their socially connected neighbors, even after you correct for age, gender, lifestyle, and lifestyle choices like exercise or eating right. And outside of the elites, what has historically always been the number one source of civil society, the number one institution in any community, it's been church. So the secularization of America has meant the deinstitutionalization of the middle class and the working class. Put another way, it's meant the alienation and the isolation of people who aren't in a community where everybody's parents went to college, who aren't in a community where just sort of wealth and connection can build up the belonging. Robert Putnam, in Bowling Alone, sort of dedicated only one chapter to religious institutions and then kind of noted, and half of all civic activity in the United States comes out of churches. So he had to write a follow-up book with a guy from Notre Dame, a Mormon, I think David Campbell, I think his name was. And another thing Putnam noted was, quote, church-going kids have better relations with their parents and other adults, have more friendships with high-performing peers, are more involved in sports and other extracurricular activities, less prone to substance abuse, da-da-da. Belonging to things helps you have good outcomes, and church has always been the most important thing to belong to. So that's sort of the positive of what community does. What does alienation do? Start this one on August 12th, 2017, Charlottesville, Virginia. Violent crowd that included neo-Nazis and white supremacists rioted, clashed with counter-protesters, including Antifa. That afternoon, a young man named James Alex Fields intentionally drove his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing a 22-year-old woman named Heather Heyer. The media reflexively blamed identity politics for the bloodshed and chaos in Charlottesville. I want to talk now about why I think that's an off-target way to label the enemy here. Blaming identity politics for something going bad is like blaming greed for a recession or blaming gravity for a plane crash. Yes, the white supremacists and Nazis in Charlottesville were practicing and peddling vile identity politics. But we shouldn't therefore presume that only these bad guys play identity politics. I argue that most politics is identity politics. More importantly, people need identities. We all need to belong to groups, and those groups need to be more specific than human being. There's some country music star who has a sign, he's trying to fight against critical race theory, and his sign just says, there is only one race, mankind. And he has put these posters up to be like It's like, okay, fine, but that doesn't tell us anything. That reductive attempt to just make us strip away our identities is not, in fact, helpful. If you think there is such thing as non-identity politics, it might be because your politics are a piece of the dominant identity. Just as a fish doesn't know he's in water, a heavily educated coastal man with center-left or center-right politics may not realize that he's in a specific subculture. This was clearest when I was following the Brexit debate from across the ocean, where there's this guy, a friend of my brother's, Felix Salmon, who was just cursing the tribalism of the fishermen in West Essex, or West Essex probably doesn't exist, of somewhere out in the podunk provinces of England. And he was just like, and my friends and I, and he describes like his friends who are from 7 different countries. And so they're not tribalistic, right? I mean, they all went to Yale and Harvard, and they get together at the curry shop in London, and then the restaurant in Paris, and then over here in New York City. He thinks he doesn't belong to a tribe because he belongs to an elite tribe. But we all belong to tribes. Stripping power from London and the UK public and transferring it to Brussels, because little old white fishermen in Little England don't know what's best, is identity politics. It's elite identity politics. Mitt Romney practiced this in 2012. He made it clear he didn't want the 47% in his party because their low income show they didn't take responsibility for their lives. People belong to tribes. Your tribe may span national and state borders. You may all have advanced degrees. That doesn't make it not a tribe or an identity. Identities and tribes are good. In fact, like gravity or greed. Greed's not good. Sorry, I almost went off on the Wolf of Wall Street, or what was it? It was Wall Street was the old movie. Gravity, greed are unavoidable. Identity is unavoidable, but I think it's also good. When people lack a coherent identity is when we get into trouble. So back to Charlottesville. James Alex Fields grew up without a father. He was kind of from Kentucky, kind of from Cincinnati. He was living in the outlying suburbs of Toledo. As far as we can tell, he didn't go to church. He was neither Midwestern nor Southern. He did try to join the military, but couldn't cut it. He lacked any visible community or tribal ties. The identity in which most people find their sense of support is community, religion, just hometown, anything like that. So he didn't go around identityless. He searched for an identity, and the one he found was white nationalism. A lot of us here might identify as Catholics, Mormons, Jews, Rhode Islanders, New Yorkers, professors, etc., or million ethnic, religious, social, geographic identities. But there are lots and lots of millions who are deracinated. That's like you pull a tree up by the roots and it's just hanging out there and you can see the roots. That's what I mean by deracination. That's the way a lot of us live our lives. When the Census Bureau would ask people your ancestry, I would say Irish. Holly Vander something would say Dutch. About 7% of America just says American, not Native American, just American. And they're concentrated in Appalachia, a lot of the places where the opioid crisis and the deaths of despair are highest. Absent a strong identity in tribe, is it surprising if a man like James Alex Fields chose his most abstract traits, his race and his nationality, and made them into his identities? White nationalism. But this is a different sort of identity than my, say, New York, Irish, Catholic, suburban dad of 6, right? This is kind of an invented identity that is more likely to be based on ideology than on organic custom, on years of music and food and relatives and history and ritual and community. Tribalism and identity politics can always be dangerous. A lot of Irish guys in Hell's Kitchen went and beat up the Polish people or the immigrants from anywhere. A lot of Episcopalian admissions officers turned away the qualified Jewish and Catholic applicants. And the Mormons, they banned black people for years, right? But that's not an argument against identity politics any more than a broken leg is an argument against gravity. Identity politics will always be there. So the question is, what sort will we have? Will it be a patchwork of a ton of different cultures in this country, and I use the word patchwork much more than melting pot, and organic tribes that are proud of and defined by an identity rooted in organically evolved custom, belief, and practice, or will it be ersatz and ugly identity politics? A couple months after Charlottesville, we got another version of this story. after a man in Las Vegas shot and killed dozens, there was an interview with his brother. The brother's line was supposed to illustrate how the shooting was totally inexplicable, how nothing in the shooter's life could explain why he would lose his mind and become a mass murderer. Here's what his brother said, quote, "No affiliation, no religion, no politics. He never cared about any of that stuff." It's easy to miss the significance of those words, to see how revealing they were. Oh, he wasn't a religious zealot. He wasn't a political radical. There go two possible motives. That was the point of the line from the brother. But if you listen to them, they become a clue. No affiliation, no religion, no politics. This should ring a bell. The Vegas shooter was a gambler, but he didn't sit at the poker table with his poker buddies. He didn't roll the dice with cheering compatriots at the craps table, and he didn't belly up to a crowded blackjack table. He played video poker. I read after the shooting a poker website said the video poker machines that he played often attract locals who are not seeking the excitement and rowdiness of live poker games. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting. It's a game of just slogging away. It's methodical and solitary. So if bowling alone represents the erosion of the civic bonds that bind us and make us fully human, what does gambling alone represent? My argument is that it showed us not the motive of that shooting, but I think that nothing in this man's life explained something about it. He was untethered to society. He was unmarried. He was unchurched. He was unrooted. He was adrift. Brother again said, quote, "Steve was a private guy. That's why you can't find any motive." Not a motive, but I think we found some of an explanation in this story of his life. And when you have no support structure, no sense of purpose, other people can become abstractions. And our political story, I think, is largely the same in recent years. And one of the problems is that alienation isn't just, I don't have a lot of friends, or I don't belong to anything. It means the lack of seeing the purpose of belonging to anything. Robert Nisbet, author of Quest for Community, defined alienation this way: the state of mind that can find a social order to be remote, incomprehensible, or fraudulent, beyond real hope or desire, inviting apathy, boredom, or even hostility. The alienated individual, quote, not only does not feel a part of social order, he has lost interest in being part of it. We've always known this was how young men joined gangs. We've known this was the story of ISIS, and we've known this was the story of white supremacists. So finally, one more date. In federal law, January 6th is the day Congress meets to review and certify the Electoral College votes of each state. In the Christian church, we know January 6th is the Epiphany. When I was there interviewing people near the White House and the ellipse by the White House or over by the Capitol, there was a lot of talk of an epiphany, religious talk, people knowingly saying, "I'm hoping for big information," one guy, Kurt, said. Today is supposed to be the day when we get some information. Another man said, oh, and then I walked over to the Capitol. I got surrounded by an angry mob. They saw my press pass and my reporter's notebook. They started yelling at me, "You're the fake news." I wasn't going to defend myself and be like, actually, I'm a conservative who just really thinks Trump was bad and he actually lost. I just took the abuse. And one woman ended it by saying, all we're doing is saying, quote, "show us this was a legitimate election." Of course, proving the election legitimate is not a possible thing. You try to point to some authority. That authority, by disagreeing with the theory, becomes inherently untrustworthy. Republican governor of Georgia, okay, he's a traitor. Vice President Pence, hang him. So at the Capitol, the protesters were demanding the counts be sent back to the states. I said, the counts came in from the states. Yeah, but the states rigged the counts. Traitors, they shouted. A man from Florida named Ronnie said, "I think there's more in the way of the computer taking votes, flipping them away from Trump." And when I asked him where he got it from, he explained that he had given up on trusting Fox News, and he liked these other sites on the website and these YouTube videos he was watching. But then he said, "I can't hardly find anything that will actually tell me what's actually going on." Another man said, "We'll never know. It's deny the truth, deny whatever." A man named Kurt said, "There's so much disinformation out there, you don't know what to believe." And so he said, "I don't want Trump to tell me what happened. I want him to show me." They wanted to see the election with their eyes, which you cannot see an election with your bare eyes. Even if you saw every ballot in one room, you would wonder if something had happened to it. So why are they demanding to see this election? There's no authority that they trust. And when you go around like I do and report out of a bar or a parking lot or a coffee shop, one term you hear a lot is, oh, I do my own research. That instantly sets off little alarm bells. No offense to the researchers in this room. But one of the things you realize, though, about people who do their own research is not that they come to all their own conclusions. It's a new sort of credulity. Well, someone would say, Tim, why do you actually believe that the vaccine against coronavirus reduces your chance of getting hospitalized or dying? I'd say, honestly, I just, at the end of the day, had to trust that Pfizer and the FDA didn't fully make up their results, right? I looked at the data. Well, how do you know nobody's fuzzing the data? I don't. At the end of the day, I trust some authority. So if you don't ever trust any authority, you're not going to know anything. But you always do trust an authority. Because if you trust the guy on YouTube, you're trusting authority. But because you found him yourself, because he wasn't spoon-fed to you, you feel like it was your own work. And a lot of the talk, when I talked to these people at the Capitol, got a little bit spiritual. And so I asked them specifically, where do you go to church? David, I don't go to church, but I am religious. I do read the Bible. I do my own studies online and stuff. Ronnie, where do you go to church? Honestly, I just read the Bible. I love reading the Bible. I should read the Bible more. Ronnie probably can quote it better than I can. I'm not going to knock him on that, but I did start to see a pattern here. Family from Alabama, very Christian, have not gone to church in years, but they're raising their kids with Christian values. One last political note, the best way to describe a Trump voter in those early Republican primaries in 2016 was a white evangelical who does not go to church. Not that they're hypocrites or anything, but that they're divorced from community. So, finally, what is left to those who live in a land of alienation? So that's not you. If you're in this room, you're connected to things. You belong to things. You belong to this school. Statistically, if you end up in college, good chance that at least one of your parents went to college and you were raised in a neighborhood where you were playing Little League and cello and belonged to things, right? So what's left in a land of alienation? It's a secular world where local different and more every day. Customs, norms, and traditions are in fact derided in our public schools, our pop culture, our elite media as repression, structures of the patriarchy, systems of white supremacy. The things we would inherit from our parents or grandparents that would be part of our culture, part of our identity, are exactly what we're supposed to overcome. And so our youth are told that the old scripts are all bad. They're all corrupt. Young woman, you need to write your own life script. And not only on what you're going to believe or what you're going to do or how you act or how you should dress, but on who you are. So I am, my Twitter bio, I think, says suburban dad, describes my job. Everybody knows, who knows me knows I'm an Irish Catholic, I'm a Mets fan, I'm a New Yorker, all of that stuff. I didn't choose any of those. I kind of chose a Mets fan, but I don't remember making that decision. I did choose a Catholic. I came into the church as an adult, but I inherited from many generations the Catholicism. And one thing about all of those things, really, really sticky to leave any of them. So even if they're chosen, and I have freedom of exit, it's not as free as just deciding not to patronize the same dry cleaner or the same CVS anymore. I'm kind of stuck to them. But the story of getting unstuck is supposed to be a story of liberation. You get to define yourself. You don't have to inherit any identity. But it's not a happy story of liberation. It's something else. An alienated world is a world with less connection and less belonging. It's a world with, statistically, we're seeing more depression among the youth, more violence, and more allure of dangerous tribes of all sorts of ideologies and stripes. So every speaker is supposed to end on a note of hope, right? And so I could offer my own everyday sources of hope. If I had a slideshow, I'd put up pictures of my kids, my wife. I teach Sunday school. My students are getting First Communion in 2 weeks, and they are killing it. They correct me all the time. I'm like, and then they violated the 10 Commandments. Mr. Carney, the 10 Commandments didn't exist by the time the flood came. I was like, okay, fine. So I could give you all these points of hope that are in my personal life, but to try to go bigger, I think it's better. I mean, go figure, God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. But for now, what I'm going to do is say that my hope in the short term, in the very short term, is this conference, this institution, that we're going to talk about identity, that we're going to talk about alienation, that we're going to talk about connection and belonging in a way that isn't just me saying, man, I wish everybody was like Oostburg, right? Because not everybody's going to become like Oostburg. Not everybody's going to become like the imagination of our Catholic parish outside of Pittsburgh in 1955, and there's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't want to become that way, right? So in this modern alienated world, how can we restore belonging? How can we restore connection? How can we restore sense of identity and a sense of meaning? So that's going to be my sense of hope. Thank you very much for listening.
Some questions? So we will, what? I guess we can go till 4:15. I don't know why not. I don't know if we'll go that far, but that's the outer limit. I always like to start with a student if that's possible. I see someone pointing a finger. I don't see a hand. Okay.
Yay.
First, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I'm probably one of the few liberals in this room, so I know I'm in a den of wolves here. I'll try to be to the point. I would agree with you that the fracturing of community, especially in America, because I'm more familiar with the American context, is probably a big reason for the effects all across that we're seeing today. But I wonder if saying it's secularization, as you said earlier in the speech, is a little bit too black and white. Because the way that I'm looking at it, I think you could trace back a good amount of the fracturing of community to conservative policies going back to Reagan, the attack on education, the attack on government bureaucrats was his big tagline, and even the work of the American Enterprise Institute. So I'm wondering if it's maybe a mix of things, especially with religious figures around that time too. Jerry Falwell. There's a lot of people would not want to join a church where Jerry Falwell's in, and that will lead to a decline in church attendance, and that will lead to a feedback loop.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of good points, and I could answer this in 4 different ways. First of all, to say that secularization is at the root of the problem doesn't let off the hook the churches that have helped cause a secularization. So one thing is, on TV churches or mega churches are or not all mega churches, but certainly TV churches on TV and some mega churches are antithetical to the sort of community that I'm talking about, the leveling, the erasing of local differences. The Mormon and the Catholic Church, the brilliance of the structure and the hierarchy is that we actually can only do this on the local level. Like, Christianity is about my relationship, first of all, with one person, right? But that one person said, we need to build the church on a rock, and the rock was another person, and it's going to be people, and then it's going to manifest itself. The reason that like when there's politics in the Vatican, it doesn't affect the average worshiper is because we don't face religion mostly by what the Vatican is doing. We face religion by what, like, our pastor is doing, the person in the pew next to us is doing, and the person leading the sodality and the weekly rosary is doing. And so, but the Catholic Church, the hierarchy in America and in Europe and other places, defended the most heinous crimes. And I've met people who have left because of that. And so when I'm talking about secularization, I'm not saying the church is just a victim here. The church has been a cause by driving people away, but also the type of churches. I think a lot of the mega church type things are averse to it. But what you're talking about with sort of, this is the way I would characterize what you're talking about with the Reagan mention. And I'm going to agree with you. There's a hyper-individualism, and it's been on the right and the left, that has, and that's exactly what I'm battling against here. Autonomy is probably the word that best captures all of this. And the hyper-individualism can show up in an economics, right? Greed is good. The Wall Street reference I made earlier is something, Ron never said greed is good, but I know sort of where you're going. We're going to deregulate, we're going to cut taxes, and however sound those policies are, and I generally will agree with those, especially to the degree that it decentralizes, because I think things need to be done on a local level, but if it leaves the impression I don't owe anything to anybody else, which is the way you hear capitalists talking about it. And ironically enough, today, I think you hear a lot of feminists on the left talking about things that way too. But if you definitely had, and my colleague Yuval Levin, my boss Yuval Levin at AEI, he wrote a book that spoke about the sort of individualistic march that began after World War II. And so it didn't begin with Ronald Reagan, but that it did a lot of good things. But one of the things it did is it made this idea of every man for himself and a rugged American individual that could be misleading. And so, you know, you and I aren't going to agree on the proper tax rates or whatever, but I do think that a hyper-individualism that sometimes reflects contemporary American capitalism is absolutely at the root of the alienation.
I'll leave some of the points for a later time, but
Yes, thank you. Right behind you.
Oh, can you pass that down, John?
Not that finding the beginning will right the ship, but being a little older, I'm wondering if it was Vietnam that started us down this road. We went from World War II, where we as a people, you know, did so much good and bad, but within a few short years, Vietnam, and it seemed like from that time on, authority in all sorts of ways got denigrated and poo-pooed and just slammed, and it's taken a long time, but the authority in our nations, in our families, and in all the institutions is gone. And again, you know, I don't know what we do from here.
Yeah. So, again, my Yuval Levin's book, Fractured Republic, argues sort of, it takes this idea of sort of waves and movement, and he says sort of Vietnam was the biggest step in something that actually started in the 1950s. We think about the 1950s as like, you know, it's solidarity, conformity, whatever, and he says that was kind of the starting point, but it was progressing in that direction. And certainly, like, you know, don't trust anyone over 35, and how it was sort of explicitly, I mean, every generation rebels against their parents, but it was made more explicit, and that Vietnam made it, sort of gave an edge to that. Like, you might die if you just do what you're told and go off to fight this war that the grown-ups have done. And so it made that more acute, and maybe left a lot of the baby boomers feeling they didn't have the moral authority to actually raise their own children. And so if I go too long, I'm going to start getting my Gen X pride up too high against the boomers and the millennials, so I won't do that. But absolutely, every time we talk about the lack of trust in institutions, as I was referring to earlier with Catholic Church scandals, we have to say a lot of that is unearned. I mean, a lot of that is earned. A lot of the distrust in institutions is earned. That doesn't mean it's good. And yeah, how we get it back is the big question.
Hi. I'm not sure if I'm going to word this right, but considering like you contribute the happiness and stability in society with a confidence through a common identity, I was just kind of curious how do you question like that sense of assimilation. Like, I know in the Dutch communities, for example, you talked about it was like happiness and positivity and
Yeah.
like support. But I know that like groups obviously and historically can curate like negative and assimilate like through like I guess monarchies and unify through like hate and stuff as well.
Yep.
So and individuals in general can die, like people who are different that aren't accepted, that is always negative. So
Yep.
I mean, do you think it could be just as dangerous for a community to be built off assimilation
So
rather than?
theoretically, one of the things I say is, so I'm an Aristotelian. Aristotle said virtue is a mean. In another country or another time, rather than writing Alienated America, I could have written like overly cloistered America or something like that. One of the arguments I make is that the U.S., better than almost any other place, overcomes that danger of conformity. So there's two parts. There's two dangers that you're highlighting here that are both real. One is conformity that makes the member who's different not be able to flourish, right? And number two is a solidarity, a unity that creates inherent tension with the other group. And, you know, again, Fishtown is a neighborhood in Philadelphia I went to, and I write in the book about that, about, you know, I think there was an Irish parish and a Polish parish. They kept separate, but I interviewed everybody and never found any stories from at least sort of my age and going back about 30 years of actual like violence and hatred. You know, a street scuffle between 12-year-olds maybe, a rivalry among the Little League teams. But, I mean, like me and the Italians and the Irish in Pelham, New York, where I grew up, it was a rivalry. There was about 2 fights along those lines in my years. But, like, that's acceptable. That can happen a lot in America. On the other hand, in Fishtown, when a black family moved in, they basically, in 1960, they basically got chased out. But one of the things that America does that allows the sort of nonconformists to thrive, because my standard way of reporting when I go to a place is to go to the bar. When I was in some of these, certainly the Mormon places, but some of these Dutch Reform places, the bars were not heavily populated. So the bar was the bar from Star Wars. It was the island of misfit toys. There was the one MAGA hat I saw was a guy in a Hawaiian shirt and a MAGA hat at a bar. And I'm like, what do you think of Oostburg? And he was like, oh, man, everybody here is the same. You know, I think that might have been where I learned that when they divide up the classrooms, they say, okay, everybody who's A through U over here and everybody who's V through Z over here. He's like, he hated the uniformity of it. So that person has always been part of every culture going back throughout history, okay? Some of them show up in the Old Testament. And what you've got in America, though, is that and Tocqueville described this beautifully, we belong to many different things that aren't all concentric. If you can just sort of stick with me on this image here. I belong to St. Andrew Apostle Parish. I also have a local pub. Like, there's a small overlap of those two circles, but I have sort of different people. There's a release valve. I belong to my work at AEI is, you know, it's a lot of conservative people, but a lot of liberal people, and certainly a lot of non-Catholic people. In my actual neighborhood, it's like the United Nations, and so I belong to many different things. Where I'm getting my identity from is not monolithic. So if you are in one of these towns that's stuck in the middle of a farm field in Iowa, there's a little more of a danger of that. But again, the town next door has a bar. And the story I tell of Oostburg, of sort of a dark episode there, was somebody wanted to create the Islamic Center of Greater Sheboygan. The word Sheboygan just makes people laugh. The Islamic Center of Greater Sheboygan. And he wanted to do it in Oostburg. And so he bought the land, and there was protest. Even one of the 4 pastors was like, this is a Christian town. We don't want this in here. Other people were like, why does he need that much land? Is this going to be a terrorist training center? This was actually a criticism of it. And so he went before the town council, and there's all these people got up. Here's why this shouldn't happen. Here's why this should happen, da-da-da. And what did the town council do? They said, we're not here to talk about Islam. We're here to talk about whether he has enough drainage for the water runoff and where he's going to put the parking spots, and he's met all of those things, so check, you get the permit. It doesn't always happen, right, in America? But the fact is that we have government, we have religion, we have neighborhoods, we have the fact that we're so varied, and again, Tocqueville is very eloquent on this, allows for that inevitable sort of individualist who doesn't fit in to find a way to fit in, or to check out and go somewhere else, or to be the sort of the oddball in town. It doesn't always work out happily. It doesn't always work out nicely. And in another age, I would be saying we need to worry more about us all having too much connection and being suffocated, right? And in DC, it's interesting, right? Because there's somebody from every single small town in the US who has left and come to DC and says, oh, my small town was so suffocating. And I'm like, but you're the one who left. Everybody else stayed. So they might have liked it. So that's always something that we have to keep in mind. The bigger problem in America is not that suffocation of small town. It's the alienation where people don't belong to anything.
Yep, it's me.
Oh, there you are.
Thanks for your talk. And you kind of just started answering a bit of my questions, so let me see if I can tweak it a bit. This is a shameless pitch for my paper tomorrow, by the way.
Oh, great.
But yeah, so two things. I want to ask you about belonging and then tradition. So, but you seem to be pointing to like some external markers of belonging. And my concern, and this is what I'm going to talk about a bit tomorrow, is like if you look at some anthropology material, like cultural anthropology, you know, like some of the communities that anthropologists have studied, you might think like this is like ultra belonging. You know, these people are like totally sociocentric, absorbed in their duties and roles. There's a lot of anthropology now that's kind of pushing against this and saying, well, when you get a little closer, it's actually really complicated individual selves who are kind of in a much more, like the belonging is more like a really complex task, right? Which the external markers might betray that struggle, yeah? So I'm wondering, I don't know if this is something you may be onto or thinking about, and maybe what some of the external markers of belonging are, right? The second one has to do with tradition. So you like did the organic tradition thing. And like I know what you're talking about, and I think I'm on board with it for the most part, but I'm still wondering what makes a tradition organic? Like, because we might say that about a tradition that we see in retrospect. Like, and then we're like, oh, that's organic, right? But it's like, well, I don't know how that began, right? I don't know what it looked like.
Yeah.
And is it like there's organic traditions and then we just don't have traditions otherwise, or we have non-organic traditions, you know? Anyway, those are two questions. Thank you.
So I think it's funny because I learned about an hour ago about a tradition here involving lectures and exactly how it began, that the student asks the first question. I would love to, and I don't know if you've written about this, I would love to think more about what we mean by organic, right? Because anytime we talk about anything, like it's a non-natural ingredient. It's like it exists, so to some extent it's natural if it's in your peanut butter, right? And so a tradition or anything, I think that, again, I'm a believer in sort of a decentralization. I often sort of distrust really clever planners. And traditions are often set up for a reason, and it's a particular reason, and then it sticks around, and it almost becomes its own good, but it becomes modified to better serve what the current needs are. And I think that also as opposed to something that's purely ideology and purely always pragmatic, it's just less likely to be spun out of control and to be weaponized. So if you think about a cult versus, and there's some people say there's not that big of a difference, but a cult versus a culture versus a religion, if the rules are all sort of created by a committee or an individual with specific purposes, that's easier to abuse than a more organic tradition where they, like, no one person got got to make it. As far as the complexity of belonging, one thing I think about, and this is a metaphor of, you used the word assimilation earlier. In America, the assimilation of immigration is not, Americans all look like this, immigrant shows up, starts looking like this. If it is a melting pot, and again, I don't love that image, it changes the flavor of everything. So everybody else assimilates to that person. I mean, if you just think about our language, our dress, our attire, our kids all do things that were brought in from other cultures, or our society always does that. So what is belonging? Belonging also involves changing the nature of the institution you belong to. I think my parish is slightly different because my family has been there for 15 years. We're like a little more baseball focused because I led the way on having baseball. I know I'm different because of stuff in our parish, and it wasn't always there. So that's what I would say about belonging, is that belonging isn't just, I'm going to match this society. I'm going to be a little bit different, and the society is going to change a little bit because I'm there. But again, I'm not a sociologist, but I think that'd be intriguing literature.
To what extent do you see technology as playing a causative role in this phenomenon of alienation versus reflecting alienation? Because clearly technologies of transportation, communication, smartphones, etc., makes it so much easier to untether myself from any place and any people.
Yep.
To what extent is that part of the problem? To what extent is that merely reflecting back to me my already alienated state?
I think it's more of a problem, and I'll say this. There's always technology shocks, and we always respond, and sometimes we make a technology end up working better for us, but at this point, we're not there with social media and smartphones. The story I always tell about the internet and that sort of stuff is, in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of people, usually male libertarians, whose personality doesn't lend themselves to face-to-face interactions going terribly smoothly. I'm being polite about a lot of my friends here. When they were in high school, some of them would say their lives were saved by the creation of bulletin board systems. So I'm seeing like a look of recognition about 4 other eyes of young Gen X or older millennials. It was sort of a pre-internet thing where you had to dial into like your buddy's computer, and you'd have your own little internet only with people who were dialing into it. Or there'd be a national BBS that was like, I'm fans of Spider-Man. And so my nerdy libertarian friends would be like, I didn't have any friends in my hometown. So I built this virtual community of Spider-Man friends. And guess what? A virtual community is better than no community. If they already would have had, so I'm answering slightly orthogonal to your question, if they already would have had no community in their high school because they didn't fit in, now they do. 1,000 other people to talk about Spider-Man with, right? This was before there were movies. So this was just not before there were movies. Before there was Tobey Maguire, even Spider-Man movies. So these were pretty, guys just reading the comic books. But the fact is that these technologies draw us away from community because it's easier just to stare at the phone. We don't talk to the person next to us at the bus stop, yada, yada. But on the other hand, I wouldn't have had a 20th high school reunion if not for the fact that we created a Facebook group and did it and got together. So I think technology is a positive to the degree that it gets you together in person. I don't think, and it can do other things, but it's a net negative to the degree that it doesn't. I think some of the need for some of this stuff has been created by alienation, but I definitely think it drives it along. Like some of the apps, like you can get somebody to walk your dog just by picking up and doing that. When we first moved to the suburbs and got a dog, we had a bunch of neighbors who we said, hey, we're going to be gone all day. Can you just let my dog out or walk her? Then we moved to another house where we didn't know our neighbors as well, and so we started using the app. So did our alienation cause us to get the app? Yes. But did using the Woof app or whatever it's called cause us to know our neighbors less? Probably. So in Alienated America, I say 100 times the causal arrows go both ways. It's self-replaced. But I actually want to ask, and sort of nod or raise your hand if you want to talk about this. The students, do you think your social media and smartphones aids your having friendships and connection, or does it detract from it on net? Do you think it generally is a good thing as far as connection? Down, thumbs up, thumbs down? Nobody's, hey, we got
Any thumbs up?
okay, we got a couple thumbs up, so it's not unanimous. That's curious. That's interesting.
Thank you for your talk. I just wondered whether you're, with respect to this issue of the alienation that comes from the departure from the model of the ethnic neighborhood. I just wonder if you're familiar with the work of E. Michael Jones. He wrote a book called The Slaughter of the Cities.
No.
And he talks, well, his theory is basically this, that the suburbs, right, are a pro-alienation, anti-ethnic community movement, right? And he also attributes the suburban movement, places like Levittown and others out of Philadelphia, also places in Montgomery County, to forces that were hostile to the ethnic neighborhood that was in the cities. It used to be you could raise healthy, large families in the cities precisely because of the ethnic neighborhood, the feeling of belonging, the mutuality of values, language, culture, right? And that then in the 50s,
Yeah.
there was this big movement to encourage people to move to the suburbs. And that this created a deracination, an uprooting of people from their roots, right? They just, instead of being, let's say, a Polish Catholic family with 7 kids, the model was, we'll just be a good American dad with 2 kids, live in the suburbs and, tidy things up. And so do you think, so my 2 questions are this. He also attributed this, in this book, The Slaughter of the Cities, which is an interesting book. He also attributes the movement, the pro-suburban movement, to a kind of concern that Catholics were getting too powerful. Right? They were having big families, prosperous or at least successful neighborhoods in places like Brooklyn, parts of Philadelphia, and in other cities, right? And that the idea was to, if you like, Americanize them, flatten them, get them just to be a kind of average Joe without too great an intense commitment to a certain culture, a certain church, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, as far as sort of the motives and what was behind it, I don't know anything about that, and it would be hard for me to imagine sort of how anybody having that desire would transfer into the construction of the suburbs. But it's certainly a part of the idea of Americanism. And I saw it on Fox News recently, this guy named Pete Hegseth, which is a Norwegian name. He said, look, I'm Norwegian American, but I don't speak any Norwegian, and I kind of wish I didn't know I was Norwegian because I think Americans should never be a hyphenated American, right? This is sort of a pushback. If you're my age, like there was this conservative pushback against the sort of diversity warriors that were running universities. No, we're just Americans. Let's get rid of the hyphen. And so there is an idea that America is supposed to be all melt into the same tone. And I've seen it in sad ways where, again, you get a cab in D.C., start talking, and I always brag and bring up that I have 6 kids. A dozen times, a cab driver who was from Pakistan, Eritrea, whatever, said, oh man, I wanted to have a big family, but I just thought, you don't do that here. So when my wife and I moved to America, we stopped at 2 because that seemed like the American thing to do. And that just always struck me as super sad, that that's how you felt you had to assimilate and fit in. And then you see people who say, my parents wouldn't speak Chinese at home at all. And like, so you didn't inherit any of your culture? It's like, no, basically when mom became a grandma and had a grandkid, I said, please, let's pass something down from our Chinese culture to our kids. But that idea that it should be stripped away and there's some American is certainly a huge mindset. The shape of modern suburbia is a very alienating force. The attached garage that you get into, you drive to the shopping center that's, 10 miles away and where you're not going to bump into your neighborhoods, absolutely has that effect. And like, to the effect that raising your kids in suburbia can be harder, even though you've got a yard. And, than in a city of 1955 or whatever, because I think just a huge thing is if kids can run around and I don't have to worry about where they are, that's just incredibly liberating as a parent and as a kid. And I think the small family size that we're seeing in America today is largely attributable to the fact that parents have to shuttle their kids around or feel they have to helicopter or whatever. And so a neighborhood that has a sense of solidarity, which increasingly is places like Chevy Chase, really rich places, where like, well, there's not going to be crime here because to even live in this neighborhood, you have to buy a $3 million house, right? That those are the neighborhoods that have that sort of thing, and there isn't the middle class, working class neighborhood that feels safe. The sort of coda to that is I looked really hard to find the really diverse community that had that strong cohesion. It is very rare in America and in America's history. So that's why I say, like, this is why I want to look forward. There has to be a unifying thread. We have to be engaged in the same undertaking, but I would like us to find ways to have communities that have more of a sense of diversity while also having that unifying higher aim that we're pointing towards.
Over here. I am a fellow Mets fan. I could see Citi Field from my apartment.
Nice.
I go to church in Jamaica, Queens, and I mean, you know how it is in New York. It's like whether it's professional managerial class or working class folks, like, people are working 50, 60 hours a week, commuting for an hour, and that's probably the biggest issue in our church when it comes to connecting. And so I guess my question is, as margin decreases for people outside of the workplace, if you only have an hour or 2 or 3 to spare, where do you feel like the pockets of solidarity and community are going to come from if we continue to trend in that direction even more?
Yeah, I think workism and difficult commutes are huge enemies of family, huge enemies of community. My own parish, the problem is that it's much more valuable for the Jewish families to live in walking distance. So almost nobody in my parish, the Catholics, don't actually live in walking distance. And so we don't have like, oh, I'm just I'm just passing by, I'm going to stop in and make a visit, or that doesn't really happen as much, and that undermines it. And so it will take deliberate, intentional things. So I had this conversation with a priest in my parish where he was like, so CYO is that's Catholic youth sports. It's like, it's kind of disappearing. Why? I said, oh, well, because in Montgomery County, like, there's a million different sports leagues. And he's like, we used to have a soup kitchen here. Well, the county, state, federal government took that over. He said, so what is the unmet need of the people in this room? On a Friday fish fry, he said that. I said, we need a place regularly where we can bring our kids and ignore them while we talk to other adults. And, like, Jesus makes it really clear, feed people. Like, feed them literal food, fish, whatever, bread. I do hamburgers. And so I started a T-ball program where I was like, come on Friday, even if you don't have a T-ball player, and just we're going to fire up the grill, and your kids are going to run around. And I saw parents become less helicopter parents. But the starting question was, what is the unmet need? The market doesn't meet every need. The government doesn't meet every need. Your job isn't meeting every need. What is the unmet need? And a lot of times it's mom wants to feed the family without planning a meal on Friday night. And honestly, I think that can be a good thing. But that every parish, every institution of civil society has to say, well, we're here to serve people. And how are we going to bring them together? People don't come together to come together, right? A lot of times they come together because you're feeding them. And so that's where I would start. What is the unmet need? And for me, I had it be at 6 o'clock on Friday because that was when aftercare let out. So if a parent couldn't even get to their kid by 6, kid just ran over and was playing t-ball, and mom showed up at 6:30, and dad showed up at 7, and we were all grilling burgers. So every institution needs to constantly be re-examining. Our people's needs are different today than they were 20 years ago. What is the unmet need? Let's provide that. That's what will bring them together. That's what will help them make sure that their identity isn't just Mets fan, but it's parishioner at Our Lady Queen of Peace or whatever it is.
I want to stay true to my promise. That was damn good. That's a very nice beginning for us. And food we have, I don't know where it is actually. Is it right outside or is it the great room? Where is it? Yep. And it's a pretty great room. All right, thank you. Let's give one last.